So good afternoon or good morning for those of you, depending on where you are in the world. And thanks everybody for joining us for this afternoon's webinar. We'll be drawing on InFocus's experiences of developing theories of change from around the world to share tips with you on how you can develop a powerful and best-in-class theory of change. We're also going to leave you with some really useful tools so that you can take this work forward after the webinar. My name is Dr. Damian Hatton. I'm a co-founder and managing director at InFocus, and I have over 20 years of experience working in the social sector, first as a medical doctor in London, and then as a charity chief executive for 10 years. And over the last 8 years, I've been supporting charities around the world with my colleagues at InFocus to firstly understand the impact of their projects with the aim of making their impact grow over time and in a more sustainable way. So thanks for joining us during this very busy period as well, running up to Christmas. We know it can be hectic to fit in these sorts of learning events at the best of times, so it's hopefully going to be a worthwhile investment of your time. Now, I'm here today with my colleague Tom Keyte, co-founder at InFocus. But before introducing Tom, or Tom introduces himself properly, I just wanted to go through some of the technical details of how this webinar will work. So you will only be able to see yourself in the attendees box at the moment, but there are, I'm pleased to say, lots of people joining us on today's webinar. We're using an online sharing software called WebEx that allows you to see the screen. So hopefully you can all see the classroom scene at the moment for how to build a powerful and best-in-class theory of change. And you'll be able to use your headphones and microphones to both hear and speak to us during the Q&A section. So we've started the call on mute, however, so that limits the background noise, which can be quite distracting if there's a lot of people on a call. And to communicate with us during the call, if you use the Q&A box, which you'll see located in your WebEx panel, we'd prefer if you could use the Q&A box as opposed to the chat box for this webinar. But if you've got a question, please feel free at any point to drop your question into the Q&A box, and one of us will dig those questions out, and we'll either answer it as we go or we'll answer it during the Q&A section at the end of the webinar. And just to mention, we will actually stick around at the end of the hour if there are any further questions that people would like to run through. So I'll now pass on to Tom without further ado to tell you a little bit more about our particular experiences with theory of change. Hi, Tom.
Hi everybody, and thank you, Damian. I'm Tom Keyte, and as Damian mentioned, I'm co-founder at InFocus and a senior learning and evaluation consultant, and I lead on many of our international projects around the world. And before we get fully into the topic of theory of change, we just wanted to say a bit more about our experience with using the technique. So this is us on the left-hand side of the map here. And just to note, and some of you already noted, or one of you, that apparently Damian and I sound the same. I don't hear this myself, so you may have some trouble determining who is who on this call. Damian and I have around 5 years experience of supporting and developing theories of change, using logical frameworks prior to this for a couple of years. And you can see all the countries that we've worked in to support theories of change on this map, and that's using live workshops and online training and our materials. And this started with developing this rather extensive theory of change, this spider's web, back in Namibia in 2011, and has included a wide range of organizations and settings, from not-for-profit organizations working on the ground to funders and networks. The last theory of change workshop I ran in person was a few weeks back, and that was in Rwanda. And just to give you an idea of how strange these can be, I was actually on leave at the time and popping in to say hello, but ended up running a 2-hour theory of change workshop, which bizarrely also had a Japanese documentary crew filming it. So it can be a bit random, and this webinar is about sharing and learning from all of these various experiences and just being open about what has worked and what hasn't. And we wanted to start with what is theory of change. So we felt it was important to start with a quick introduction and overview to the technique, as there's likely to be a bit of a mix of experience and knowledge on this call in relation to theory of change. This section may be familiar to some of you who've been on our webinars before, but given the different uses of the term theory of change, it's important for us all to be on the same page. So I want to start this introduction to theory of change in rather a different way. So my sister is really difficult to buy presents for. If you get it wrong at Christmas, you might get the present returned directly to you or left at the house. And I would guess my success rate is around 30 or 40%. And rather than being discouraged, I see it as a challenge. So my best success was with something called the X Mini, which is a very small portable speaker. And when I thought about why that was a successful present, I think it's partly because my sister works in product design, and I think it's a product that's extremely well thought through in relation to what it's designed to do. So it's tough, it's compact, it's got good sound quality. In a totally different example, if you're designing an airport, your priority could be to reduce queues and get people to the gates as quickly as possible. This rendering of a new concept for Gatwick Airport. So in each of these cases, the designer started with a design that shows how the product or building will fulfill its purpose. It's in effect a blueprint of how it will work, and we see the use of theory of change in much the same way. It's a blueprint for how you believe your activities will lead to social change. So it's a design for your programs and how they will work. And the next thing I want to go into is just a little bit about the core components of a theory of change. So we've taken these from two reports from Comic Relief and DFID in 2009 and 2011. And firstly, our definition we like to use is theory of change is an ongoing process of reflection to explore change in a particular context, so in the context of wider society. And the core components that we tend to or that were identified that were common across a number of theories of change, and this is from a DFID report in 2012, were firstly that it has includes context, so it places the activities within a wider environment. Secondly, that it includes long-term change, so that it has outcomes and long-term impact. That there's a process and sequence of change, so it's showing in effect causes of cause and effect, that there are assumptions, so it's showing the main beliefs behind why certain activities lead to outcomes and how outcomes are linked. And finally, that there's a diagram and narrative summary, so that there's a particular way of representing a theory of change. So theory of change as a term can be used quite differently, but these are some of the core components that we tend to follow in terms of what should a theory of change have in place to be a theory of change. And finally, just before passing back to Damian, an example we often use is, and many of you have seen this before, he keeps being retired then brought back, is Tiny. So Tiny is an overweight cat in the United States, and a few years ago he went on a diet which was publicized on social media because he was absolutely enormous. And if we take his weight as a problem here, then that we're dealing with, then traditionally with, for example, other techniques like logic models, where you're mapping out your activities, you might then take a next step of thinking, okay, what activities can we do to get Tiny to a healthier weight? But actually, theory of change, one of the key differences is that you go forward to the impact that you want to see, so a thinner, healthier Tiny, and then you work backwards from that point into the activity, well, the outcomes, and I think we've combined outcomes activities here, the changes you want to see for Tiny to be that healthier weight. That actually is Tiny sitting on the scales there. So in this example, it might be what we'd call an external factor. So perhaps the next door neighbor is overfeeding Tiny, and that needs to be cut down. Or it might just be that Tiny needs to eat less and reduce his portions, or finally that you might want to walk Tiny and give them some exercise. So a theory of change, we call it backwards mapping. It starts with the impact, it works backwards, and it considers external factors.
So when we help or guide the development of a theory of change in focus, the end result comprises usually of 3 separate documents. And here we're going to use an example of our latest theory of change, which we developed just last month for an organization called UWA, who are based out in east of India. So a theory of change in focus is firstly documented through a longer form theory of change in PowerPoint usually, and it goes into detail on each section, and you can see here there are 2 pages of the text being shown from a longer form theory of change. The second element is a narrative, which describes the flow through the theory of change. And finally, we look at a 1-page summary of the theory of change. And I'm going to go through each of these component parts that Tom has mentioned for the theory of change by using basically the 1-page summary form of the theory of change. So this is the longer form. We've then got a narrative, and now we have the shorter form 1-page summary, which we'll now go through just to demonstrate the 6 key components as described by Tom earlier. So the first component is really talking about the situation. So you'll notice that there may be some different terminology used on this 1 page, and that's really important as well, to adapt terminology to the preferred terminology of the organization. Organizations tend to have their own internal language that makes sense to them. So in the top yellow box, we've got really reference to what we call the situation. And this includes the context in which an organization and its programs are operating. So in the context of UWA, we have the social problem that they're dealing with. So this is described in this top box, including a lack of education for girls that keeps them in poverty, and they may be forced into child marriage or become a risk of being trafficked. So that's the social problem that UWA is tackling. And secondly, there's a context. Also referenced in part in here in this shorter form, in terms of girls often don't know their own rights, or they lack the confidence to speak up. And the characteristics of beneficiaries and participants are also an important part of the situation. And so we'll now move to the left-hand side of this of the short form theory of change, where we've got a clear description here of who we work with. And that includes underprivileged young people, aged 15 to 18, from tribal and low caste backgrounds in Jharkhand. So the final component of situation statement in regards to a program or organization relates to the assets. And these are really the different materials, the different people, the different assets that an organization has at its disposal to really address the problem that they're trying to work on. And in relation to you again, there's a reference here to a relationship with local government, which could indeed be seen as an asset for the organization in executing its programs. We then, as shown with Tiny, we jump over to the impact. So on the right-hand side, we've got, what is the longest term change that's sought for the target community and wider society? So an example statement here is to improve gender equality in future generations. We then have outcomes mentioned and documented in terms of the changes that occur for the target beneficiaries or participants that are involved in a program or series of interventions. And these really act as forerunners for the wider impact to take place. These outcomes are often called preconditions as they relate to the conditions required for social change to occur. So an example here is securing good jobs and becoming financially independent. And again, some earlier stage outcomes are listed here in terms of girls thinking critically and creatively to solve problems. So the final two elements are activities and interventions. They're described as being programs on this diagram. And these are really the deliberate planned actions which are directed towards bringing about specific outcomes and impact. So there's three categories of program that you run in terms of football teams, workshops, and educational interventions. And the next thing to really mention on this slide or the final thing, are the assumptions. So these are really the core beliefs which underpin the understanding of cause and effect, how by carrying out X, you're likely to get result Y. And how certain activities and conditions are really expected to bring about the change. So assumptions can also be seen here as, or regarded as being, the conditions that are already in place, rather than the changes that actually need to take place in future. So that's just an example from a partner organisation in east part of India, who've been through a theory of change process and have fully documented in the kind of recommended way, if you like. Now, theories of change can be developed at various different levels, and this is certainly something that's important for you as an organisation to define where's the best place to focus your theory of change efforts. And different types of organisation, be it a funder, or be it a network coordinating body, or an organisation that perhaps works frontline with beneficiaries, something that we term either a delivery agency or a grantee. But they're variously termed here in the yellow boxes. And so we tend to have a range of organisations involved in the change process. So funders tend to fund delivery agencies or their grantees or network members. And the grantees, delivery agencies, will exert their influence directly upon beneficiaries. Funders will also have a direct impact, often on a social problem itself, to create social impact, perhaps through what we call more enabling activities. Things like advocacy work, things like building partnerships and coalitions, as well as funding individual delivery agencies. So theory of change can be used as a technique to map out the change process between these different levels. And wherever your social change initiatives are exerting their maximum effect, or the results are most prominent from your work, is really the area where you want to focus the theory of change exercise around. But in some instances, for example with funders who may have a range of different areas that they're exerting results and achieving results in, they may well actually go through a theory of change, a series of theories of change exercises to map out those individual areas.
We're now going to go into our 5 tips for creating a best-in-practice theory of change, which is really the core of this webinar. And whether you're starting out or looking to improve your theory of change, these tips represent some important advice and focus we give to our clients and organisations we work with in relation to creating a more effective and high-quality theory of change. Our first piece of advice, our first tip, is to make your theory of change easy on the eye, so to make it as good-looking as you can. And when we first started creating theories of change at InFocus, we were very focused on creating very detailed, more scientific theories of change that really reflected the complexity of the situations that organizations were working with and delivering on the ground. But actually, we've learned developing a theory of change is really more of a balance between simplicity and representing that complexity. And this, we feel, is expressed in this quote. So everything should be as simple as possible, but not any simpler. And we found it really useful now to always develop a 1 to 2 page theory of change to support the longer form theory of change document. And you saw an example earlier with EUA, and here you can see another example. This is from a coalition of sport for development organizations in New Orleans. So this is a shared theory of change across those different organizations. And there's some simple design elements included here, but it's all about the simpler communication of the theory of change. And these 1 or 2 page versions are really the equivalent. If we go back to our blueprint analogy, if it's a house, it would be the equivalent of a showroom brochure. If it was a product, these would be your marketing materials. This is about how to express your theory of change in a much simpler, more digestible format. And you lose some of the interconnectedness and the complexity, but that's reflected in the longer form. And we'd really recommend, if you can get a graphic designer or a design-orientated member of staff involved, it can really help with this version. So in the EUA example you saw earlier, we were taking silhouettes of the photos of their participants just to try and give it a bit more character.
So at the same time as taking that tip on board, don't fear the detail behind a theory of change. You know, human beings and the situations in which many of your programs are operating are very complex, and social change itself is complex to the extent that there is certain categories or types of social problems that have been defined as wicked problems, or indeed super wicked problems. So what we mean by a wicked problem is it's a problem that's difficult or impossible to solve because of incomplete, contradictory and changing requirements that are often difficult to recognize. So if that's challenging, the step up from that would be a super wicked problem. We're all familiar with global climate change, which in itself really generated this definition of super wicked, with the characteristics of there being time running out, no central authority through which command and control to solve the problem can take place. Those actually seeking to solve the problem are actually already also the causes of the problem, and policies discount the future irrationally. So these are some of the characteristics to the kind of problems that your mission and vision of your organization may be setting out to achieve. So from that point of view, we really recognize now that whole systems level thinking is required to address these things effectively, and often collective action of many different actors is required to resolve them, which is really where theory of change comes into play. Originally, it was actually utilized as a tool for community-wide initiatives, because it was felt that those initiatives couldn't capture the whole range of different outcomes and change that needed to take place within an entire community. So really, a theory of change can help disentangle some of this complexity for you. So it's important to take that challenge on when creating one. This image here is really of a workshop that we carried out, and an example of what that kind of complexity can start to look like during a workshop. But it's important that this process of thinking is taken through, and the longer form theory of change is really a place to demonstrate, as far as possible, your understanding of the complexity and also the role your organization actually plays in it. And it also shows that you've really thought through the detail as well as the wider context in which you're actually operating. And it's worth noting that funders and social investors into social sector programs are increasingly looking for this kind of evidence of your thinking and having gone into the detail to ensure that their investments being made into programs are being well spent. So a longer form theory of change is also important in particular for social impact measurement and deciding what to actually measure. If we go back to the analogy previously of a blueprint really helps you to pinpoint where, to best assess or stress test, if you like, whether a building, a product, a machine, or indeed a social program is actually working properly and actually fit for purpose in terms of achieving the end goal. So also the detail is important to make explicit in this model. What are those causal links between the things that you do, the activities, and the outcomes that you're hoping to achieve? And in terms of outcome measurement and impact measurement, considering whether these linkages are actually well established, and that may be through existing evidence base to support them, and or whether there's a range of integrated interventions being proposed by you to actually achieve a particular outcome. These are important things in deciding whether an outcome is really for you to measure or not. So in terms of dealing with the complexity, taking that on, and the challenge of reviewing your complexity, it's an important element of the theory of change exercise to really embrace.
Our third tip is around using your theory of change to tell a story. So we really feel from our experience that a theory of change should capture the ethos or the character, the spirit of the organization that it's representing, or the programs of the organization it's representing. And it's a story of how you believe your activities will lead to social change. And this can manifest itself through the structure of a theory of change, and we're going to see that in this example below from GDM in Mozambique. And so their theory of change, I think we can zoom in a bit further on this as well. So you can see that their theory of change is circular, and the reason that is because they believe that a holistic approach is very important. I think GDM are on the call actually, and that to support an individual to choose the type of life they want to live, you need to address a range of areas within Manica, within the community they work in. So it's not a linear theory of change. It looks a bit different, but it does help to represent the character of the organization. And then there's an accompanying narrative to this, which is then very important for that story. So the narrative is a particularly key part of the theory of change for telling the story, hence being called a narrative, but also for going into a bit more detail about the links between activities and outcomes, and between outcomes and the logic and the theory between the different elements of a theory of change. So telling a story is important both through the structure and through the narrative.
So the fourth tip we have is to compare and contrast your theory of change. So once you've developed a first draft, it can be a useful exercise to compare this to other organizations working in similar fields, or to what we call a common theory of change that are developed to identify the common areas across organizations who are working in that similar field. So in Focus, we've been working on what we call learning communities that are based around the development of a common theory of change. And these communities bring together hundreds of organizations from around the world to exchange knowledge and ideas on sport for development program methodologies that are really designed to bring about a range of different social impacts in different thematic areas, using the theory of change methodology to map out both the similarities and differences in various approaches that are being used in different contexts. We've worked on 2 communities so far for gender and disability, and are about to start a third community on sport for employment outcomes. The example here is the one-page common theory of change for the gender learning community, which looks and includes all the similar components that are found in an individual organizational theory of change, but then really are looking at the common components of problem, situation, impact, and outcome pathways. So learning communities will really help you develop a stronger theory of change by having a common theory of change that you can review and compare against to see if you have actually missed anything in your own theory of change, and demonstrate where those causal linkages are and where they're most well established and evidenced. So we also focus within the learning communities on gathering and corralling the evidence that substantiates some of these linkages between activities and outcomes in particular. However, one caveat to this is we would advise that you create your own theory of change first, in a participatory way with your team, your stakeholders, maybe including some of your beneficiaries. And that's really to make sure that you involve them first and foremost in the formative process, and then secondarily look at some of the introduce the common theory of change from your sector, just so it doesn't distort some of the thinking and your own particular creativity of your own organization in generating your own theory of change. But this can subsequently be a very useful benchmark against which to then compare whether you've really covered all the necessary territory.
And our final tip is not to let the theory of change gather dust. So what we mean by that is to be intentional and proactive about how you'll use your theory of change, and not let it gather dust in a folder or be buried deep within your laptop or filing cabinet somewhere. And there are a number of different ways to use your theory of change, which after all is the point at which the real value is realized from all the efforts it takes to create one. So it could be used, for example, for strategic planning and program design, for social impact measurement, so for the basis of monitoring, evaluation, and or research. It could be used for learning and improving, so for self or external evaluations. It could be used for planning, for growth, or for marketing and fundraising. So there's lots of different uses of a theory of change. Our example here is from Spirit of 2012 in the UK, and their commitment to best practice in this area is demonstrated by the priority they placed on developing a theory of change right at the start of their life as a trust. And their theory of change is now at the heart of their social impact measurement efforts, and it also drives the communication of their activities they fund and support. And you can see this when you look at their website, because the theory of change has its own web page. It takes quite a prominent position within their communications online. And you can find a really interesting example of how they express their theory of change in a booklet format there as well.
So there you have it. There's our 5 tips that we would recommend for every organization going through a theory of change to take into account as they go through the process. So within this webinar, we were hoping to run through a basic understanding and introduction to the topic, pass on some of our experience and some of the lessons learned as we've trialed with different approaches and different ways of moving forwards with the technique of theory of change, which is always in a pragmatic and practical way when working with real-life organizations with real-life constraints on the ground. So what next for you in your efforts to create a theory of change, or indeed, if you have one, strengthen it? Well, firstly, we'd like to offer you 2 free tools to take away from this webinar and support you on that journey. And we're not saying that it's going to be a simple and straightforward task to actually carry out. We know it's going to take more learning and more focus from yourself to, if you're leading the theory of change exercise for your organization. So the first tool really focuses around this idea of furthering your knowledge and understanding of the topic of theory of change. So at InFocus, we use a range of different techniques to pass on knowledge, and one of those is through an e-learning course. So I'm now sharing with you our e-learning site, which we'll send a link through to just after this webinar. And there are a number of different modules. This happens to be also translated into Russian, as we've done quite a bit of work in Eastern Europe recently. But the e-learning course is simply accessed through the e-learning site by clicking on these buttons, and the e-learning course is usually downloaded within a few minutes, and it's embeds within itself a whole range, as you can hear, of content, both audio files that give you some guided information and assistance as you work through the course. There's a range of different activities to undertake as you go through the course, and it will really be quite a next level of understanding of the topic of theory of change. So I'll just click through onto a few of the different slides so you can get a flavor for what the content looks like. So these e-learning icons really represent the different types of content as you go through in terms of top tips, linking through to third-party resources, real-world examples, and further reading to further expand your knowledge and understanding. Goals for the Future is a case study that we use as a fictitious case study, but really encompasses all the sorts of challenges and types of approaches that are being used through Sport for Development in this instance in working with beneficiaries frontline. So that's hopefully a useful resource for you to both share internally with your own members of staff, as well as when you're going through a theory of change exercise. It's very useful to get everybody on the same page as to why we're using this technique and what it's all about, to really orientate people before kicking off the exercise. Now, the second resource that we just want to bring to your attention is a PowerPoint that acts as a template when you're creating a theory of change for you to document. And it serves two purposes, the template. This will be, again, a link to download the resource following this webinar. So the template is a place to store your information as you're generating it around the problem, the beneficiaries, and the situation. But it also contains, again, audio files and guidance, as you can hear there, to take you through exactly what we mean by different component parts, and just as a reminder and as a prompt as to what kind of information you're looking to populate within the different sections of the workbook. So this can be obviously used for repeatedly if you're focusing your theory of change exercise in different aspects of your work, maybe at the program or project level, or indeed at the whole organizational level, or particular aspects of the work that you do. So those are two resources, and the final thing to mention on this call is that we are more than happy as a team of consultants who all work regularly and have great experience within the area of theory of change to speak to any of you. We offer one-to-one consultations to really help you think through, what kind of actions you might need to take to drive forward this a theory of change exercise for your own organization, or indeed strengthen what you're already doing. So after this after the webinar, we'll also send you a link so that if you do want to have a conversation with us further, you're more than welcome to sign up to a slot with one of our consultants who can talk you through really what the nuts and bolts and how the approach in terms of the scope of doing the theory of change exercise and the focal area for your theory of change might change and influence the methods that you and the approach you take to working with your team to develop it. So we'd be happy to help you work through the action planning stage of developing your theory of change. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. We're now going to move into a question and answer phase for the webinar. And we've already noted that there's a whole bunch of questions come through on the Q&A panel. So we'll now move into reviewing some of those questions and have a little bit more interaction in the webinar and get your thoughts and feedback.